The hall is already breathing before you step inside, warm air heavy with wax smoke, crushed rushes underfoot, and the low murmur of people who know they are about to witness something that will outlive them. Torches flicker like nervous thoughts along stone walls, and somewhere beyond the pillars a choir tests its voices, the sound echoing as if the building itself is clearing its throat. You feel it immediately. This is not just a wedding. This is a fault line. Hey guys, tonight we walk straight into a moment that looks soft on the surface. Silk sleeves, gold rings, polite smiles. But underneath it, entire kingdoms are quietly holding their breath. You stand among nobles who pretend to admire embroidery while mentally counting armies. A crown prince shifts his weight, aware that the person he is about to marry is less a partner and more a living treaty. You can almost hear maps being redrawn in the minds of diplomats who have not slept properly in weeks. Somewhere in the crowd, a bored courtier yawns, unaware that centuries from now historians will still argue whether this exact yawn happened before or after a war became inevitable. You probably won't survive this story with your innocence intact, but that's fine. You came here to sleep, not to feel safe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's strangely comforting to know who else is awake while history quietly rearranges itself. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You remain in the hall as the vows are spoken, because the vows are the point. Royal marriages were never private affairs. They were public machinery, carefully assembled to move borders without lifting swords. At least, that was the hope. One mainstream fact you can hold on to as you drift. In medieval and early modern Europe, marriages between ruling houses were among the most common tools of diplomacy, often replacing or postponing open warfare. A ring could succeed where an army failed, or just as often, fail spectacularly and make the army necessary again. As you watch, you realize the bride's smile is practiced. She has crossed borders already, leaving behind language, food, saints, even the rhythm of prayer she grew up with. Her dowry has crossed with her, ships heavy with silver, tapestries, jewels, and legal promises written in careful Latin. That dowry is not a gift. It is leverage. If the marriage collapses, those chests become arguments. If an heir is born, they become justification. Historians still argue whether dowries stabilized kingdoms more effectively than standing armies, or whether they simply delayed the violence. You notice how everyone is watching the couple's hands. The moment fingers interlace, two bloodlines are officially tangled. Bloodlines mattered more than personalities. You could be cruel, kind, dull, or brilliant. What mattered was who your grandparents were. Genealogy functioned like an international language. When a king married his daughter to a rival's son, he was not being sentimental, he was planting future claims. Decades later, when someone said, "Actually, that throne should be mine," they would point not to conquest, but to a wedding portrait gathering dust in a gallery. There's a quirky detail you might miss if you blink. Beneath the ceremonial finery, many royal brides wore amulets stitched into their gowns. Some were blessed relics, others frankly superstitious charms meant to ensure fertility or ward off envy. One French queen reportedly carried powdered toad bone sewn into her bodice because a court physician swore it discouraged miscarriages. Remember that royal policy often coexisted happily with medieval nonsense. As the ceremony ends, bells ring and you feel the shift. Somewhere far away, a border garrison will soon receive new instructions. A tax rate may change. A city might gain privileges because it sits inside the bride's ancestral lands. This is the first way royal marriages affected entire kingdoms, instantly and quietly. No speeches to peasants, no announcements carved in stone, just a slow administrative ripple that changes who answers to whom. You drift with the procession into the feast, where roasted meat steams and wine flows with dangerous generosity. Here, alliances are toasted into existence. A joke shared between uncles becomes a future military pact. A perceived insult becomes a grievance that grandchildren will inherit. You hear laughter, but it has an edge. Everyone knows that tonight's celebration is tomorrow's paperwork. One mainstream fact settles in as you listen to goblets clink. Many medieval wars can be traced directly to contested marriage agreements. The War of the Spanish Succession, for example, erupted because competing royal houses interpreted marriage-linked inheritance rights very differently. You don't need the dates to feel the pattern. Weddings promised clarity, then delivered ambiguity wrapped in velvet. The bride and groom finally sit, exhausted already, and you realize something unsettling. They are not the main characters. The marriage itself is. The individuals are vessels expected to produce heirs like living clauses in a contract. Fertility becomes national security. Failure to conceive is not private sorrow but public crisis. Historians still argue whether the pressure placed on royal couples actually reduced fertility through stress, or whether that's just modern projection onto past bodies. A court jester stumbles through a routine, making light of marriage with exaggerated groans. The crowd laughs too hard. Humor is a release valve. You catch one of the three light jokes history allows per 1,000 words. If marriage is a battlefield, then medieval weddings were clearly planned by generals who had never met the troops. As night deepens, you feel how this single union already binds people who have never met. A farmer on one side of the border will wake tomorrow owing taxes to a new lord. A merchant will gain access to roads previously closed. A monastery will pray for a queen whose name the monks still mispronounce. All because two people said yes under a roof that smelled faintly of damp stone and incense. You linger on the thought that love was optional. Sometimes it appeared, sometimes not. The system did not care. What mattered was continuity, stability, or at least the illusion of it. Royal marriages were supposed to freeze politics into something manageable. Instead, they often acted like cracks in ice, thin, quiet, and capable of spreading for generations before anyone noticed the lake was about to give way. As the feast winds down, servants scrape plates and the hall exhales. You sense that this is only the beginning. This wedding will echo forward into councils, rebellions, reforms, and whispered scandals. Remember this moment: the breathing hall, the interlaced hands, the belief that a marriage can hold a kingdom together. You will see that belief tested again and again. You don't leave the hall when the candles burn low. Instead, you drift forward in time, as if the stone floor itself carries you, smoothing centuries under your feet. The wedding feast fades, but the consequences stay loud. Now you're standing in a quieter space. Archives, family trees, whispered conversations behind tapestries, where bloodlines are counted more carefully than coins. You notice how names repeat. The same handful of royal names echo across borders, generations looping back on themselves. Cousins marry cousins. Uncles negotiate the futures of nieces, and suddenly half of Europe feels like one complicated, deeply awkward family reunion. This is not romance. This is diplomacy written in flesh. One mainstream historical fact anchors you here. European royal houses deliberately intermarried to create webs of kinship that reduced the likelihood of war, at least on paper. When rulers shared blood, conflict could be framed as a family dispute rather than outright annihilation. You watch envoys unroll genealogical charts like weapons. Lines and branches become arguments. My king's grandmother was your queen's aunt, someone insists, as if biology itself demands obedience. Bloodlines become legal evidence. You realize that ancestry functions like a slow-moving army, advancing claims decades after the original marriage. Historians still argue whether these kinship networks genuinely promoted peace or simply postponed larger, messier conflicts. A child is born somewhere in a distant palace, and you feel the room tense. Heirs are never just babies. They are potential solutions, or problems waiting to mature. Baptisms double as political announcements. The choice of godparents alone can tilt alliances, because inviting the wrong relative might insult another kingdom. Even names are chosen strategically. Naming a child after a rival's ancestor is a polite threat wrapped in tradition. There's a strange, almost absurd detail that slips through the seriousness. Some royal families kept marriage calculators. informal court traditions where astrologers, monks, or trusted advisors tried to predict which bloodlines mixed best. One Habsburg advisor allegedly claimed that marrying too far outside the family weakened divine favor, while marrying too close angered God in different ways. The result? A family tree that looks less like a tree and more like a knot. Remember that policy often leaned on superstition wearing a scholarly robe. You follow one bloodline stretching across borders and you feel how entire populations become attached to private bodies. A queen's womb becomes a geopolitical zone. Every cough sparks rumors. Every missed monthly cycle sends messengers galloping. When fertility falters, blame spreads quickly. Bad air, foreign food, witchcraft, divine punishment, or, most conveniently, the bride herself. Historians still argue whether infertility accusations were sincere belief or political strategy designed to justify annulments. As you drift through court corridors, you overhear arguments that sound oddly modern. We need stronger claims. We need closer kinship. We need legitimacy people will accept. Blood is currency here. Shared ancestry gives rulers a narrative to sell to nobles and clergy alike. You realize how marriage allowed conquest without invasion. If your grandson sits on another throne, you don't need to conquer that land. You inherit it. A light joke slips in because history allows you a breath. If medieval diplomacy had a dating app, it would have filtered exclusively by grandparents and land acreage. Swipe right for duchies, but the humor fades when you notice the cost. These marriages narrow genetic pools, and you see the long-term consequences written in portraits: distinctive jaws, fragile health, early deaths. The famous Habsburg jaw isn't just a curiosity, it's a visual record of diplomacy gone too far inward. One mainstream fact surfaces quietly: excessive dynastic intermarriage contributed to hereditary health problems that weakened several ruling houses over time. You sense a contradiction. Bloodlines are supposed to stabilize kingdoms, yet they often introduce fragility. A sickly heir can undo decades of careful planning. A childless marriage throws succession into chaos. Suddenly, that tidy family web becomes a trap, pulling multiple kingdoms into dispute over who counts as closest kin. You pause on a scholar hunched over parchment, arguing softly with himself. Is legitimacy something people feel, or something rulers impose? Historians still argue whether bloodline claims mattered more than military power, or whether they simply provided a polite excuse for violence already desired. As time slides on, you realize something unsettling and calming at once. Ordinary people rarely consented to these bloodline games, yet their lives bent around them. Taxes rose to fund dowries. Sons were drafted because a cousin's cousin had a claim. Borders shifted, and peasants learned new oaths by heart, never having seen the marriage that caused it. You carry forward the image of those tangled family trees, roots and branches indistinguishable. Royal marriages didn't just link two people, they fused identities, rewrote loyalties, and made ancestry itself a governing force. The vows spoken generations ago still whisper instructions to the present, and as you drift onward, you sense that blood alone was never enough. Soon, gold will enter the picture, heavy and persuasive, clinking beside these shared veins. You move on without a break, carried by the soft scrape of parchment and the unmistakable weight of money-changing hands. Bloodlines may justify power, but gold makes it practical. The marriage hall fades again, replaced by counting tables, ledgers, locked chests, and guards who suddenly look very alert. This is where royal marriages stop being poetic and start being expensive. You watch a dowry arrive. It doesn't come quietly. Wagons creak under the strain of silver plate, bolts of cloth, crates of spices, and sealed documents that matter more than the jewels stacked on top of them. A dowry is not just wealth, it's proof of seriousness. One mainstream historical fact settles beside you. Dowries in royal marriages often equaled or exceeded a kingdom's annual revenue, and their transfer could reshape national finances overnight. You notice how everyone pretends this is a gift, when it's really a transaction. The bride's family pays to secure influence, peace, or future claims. The groom's family accepts, knowing refusal would be interpreted as insult or weakness. And always, the fine print matters. If the marriage ends without heirs, the dowry might return home, or it might not. Those clauses will fuel arguments long after the wedding candles melt into waxy puddles. You follow the dowry into a treasury where it does something quietly dangerous. It pays soldiers. Coin buys loyalty faster than blood ever could. A king short on cash suddenly finds himself able to hire mercenaries, repair fortifications, or forgive noble debts. In this way, marriage funds armies without announcing war. Historians still argue whether dowries were meant primarily as peacekeeping tools or as strategic war chests disguised as domestic arrangements. There's a quirky, almost absurd detail hiding here. In some courts, portions of a dowry were deliberately displayed for weeks, jewels laid out like a museum exhibit, so rivals could see exactly how rich the alliance had made the kingdom. It was medieval flexing, and everyone understood the message. We can afford trouble if you start it. Remember that. Intimidation didn't always wear armor. As you drift through financial chambers, you realize debts are the shadow twin of dowries. Marriage could erase old obligations or create new ones. A royal union often came bundled with loan forgiveness, trade privileges, or promises to underwrite another ruler's wars. Gold moves faster than diplomats. When money crosses borders, so does dependence. You pause at a council meeting where a king rubs his temples, staring at columns of numbers. His marriage brought wealth, yes, but also expectations. Allies now expect support. If his new in-laws go to war, refusing aid would look like betrayal. Suddenly, a wedding obligates him to conflicts he never planned to fight. Historians still argue whether these financial entanglements made wars more likely by creating chains of obligation no one could easily break. A light joke sneaks in, because even treasurers needed humor. Medieval accountants must have invented the concept of creative budgeting, since every war somehow traced back to a wedding 3 generations earlier. You follow the money outward, and you see how entire populations feel its weight. Taxes rise to repay loans taken to fund lavish dowries. Merchants benefit from new trade agreements written into marriage contracts. Ports boom or decline based on who married whom. Ordinary people don't attend royal weddings, but they absolutely pay for them. One mainstream fact lands heavily here. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile didn't just unite crowns, it pooled resources, allowing Spain to fund military campaigns and overseas ventures that neither kingdom could have managed alone. You feel how a wedding ring can ripple all the way to ships disappearing over the horizon. But money doesn't just enable power, it distorts it. You notice resentment brewing among nobles excluded from these financial benefits. A court favorite whispers that the queen's homeland is draining the treasury. Xenophobia grows legs when coin flows outward. Suddenly, foreign influence becomes a convenient accusation. Historians still argue whether economic jealousy played a larger role in anti-foreign sentiment than cultural differences did. You drift into a quieter room where contracts are signed, and you realize how legalistic these marriages are. Clauses specify who controls which lands, who pays for which defenses, and what happens if one spouse dies young, which, given medieval medicine, was not hypothetical. These documents read less like love letters and more like contingency plans for disaster. There's a strange intimacy to it. A marriage contract might decide the fate of border towns the couple will never visit. You picture a farmer plowing a field, unaware that his tax rate just changed because a dowry clause transferred his land's revenue to a foreign treasury. This is how royal marriages affected entire kingdoms, not through drama alone but through paperwork. You sense tension building as money meets military ambition. A well-funded kingdom becomes confident. Confidence invites challenge. Rivals eye those overflowing treasuries and calculate whether a war might be worth the risk. Ironically, the wealth meant to secure peace can make conflict more tempting. Historians still argue whether prosperous alliances deterred war or provoked it by appearing too powerful. As night settles again, you carry forward the image of gold stacked high, glinting in torchlight. Blood may claim thrones, but money keeps them. Royal marriages fuse the two, turning private unions into public balance sheets. And just beyond the treasury doors, armor waits patiently, ready to convert silver into violence at a moment's notice. You drift onward, understanding now that once money enters the marriage, power rarely stays still. Soon, you'll see what happens when brides themselves begin to wield that power directly. You don't hear the armor yet. Instead, you hear footsteps, measured, confident, echoing through corridors that were never meant to belong to her. The gold is counted, the contract sealed, and now the bride steps into a role no one publicly announced but everyone quietly expects. This is where marriage stops being something done to her and becomes something done by her. You watch her sit on a raised chair while men with titles argue in circles. At first, they speak as if she isn't there. Then they realize she remembers the clauses better than they do. One mainstream historical fact steadies the scene. Many queens consort and royal wives ruled as regents while their husbands were at war, ill, or simply uninterested, exercising real authority over entire kingdoms. You notice how her power is always framed as temporary, conditional, borrowed, just until the king returns, just until the heir comes of age. And yet during those just moments, laws are passed, taxes raised, rebellions crushed, and alliances made. History later summarizes these years politely, but you can feel the tension in the room. Authority does not like sharing space. There's a small human detail you might miss. The queen's handwriting becomes recognizable across documents, slightly slanted, firm. Clerks learn to spot it instantly. A signature, repeated often enough, becomes sovereignty. Remember that power sometimes arrives not with a crown but with muscle memory. You drift closer to a map table. She points decisively. Border disputes are discussed as if they're puzzles, not lives. When she orders troops repositioned, no one laughs. They hesitate, then obey. Historians still argue whether female regents ruled more cautiously than their male counterparts, or whether that perception reflects later bias rather than evidence. A quirky tidbit slips in here. Some queens kept parallel councils made up of their own advisors, often men from their homeland, operating quietly alongside official structures. Critics called these shadow governments. Supporters called them efficient. Either way, policy flowed through marriage in both visible and invisible channels. You sense resistance. Nobles mutter about foreign influence again, especially when the queen's accent colors her commands. They claim loyalty to the crown while bristling at her authority. It's a familiar contradiction. They accept the marriage's benefits but resent its consequences. One light joke drifts through the tension. Apparently, nothing unnerved medieval lords quite like a woman who read contracts before signing them. Yet the regency holds. You watch her manage famine relief, negotiate ransoms, and decide which fortresses get repaired first. These are not ceremonial acts. These decisions determine who eats and who starves. A marriage brought her here, but competence keeps her standing. You follow her into a chapel late at night. Candles flicker. She prays not for love, but for heirs and stability. Fertility remains her unspoken job description. Even as she governs, her body is still treated as infrastructure. Historians still argue whether the psychological burden placed on ruling queens affected their decision-making, or whether that's another modern lens applied too freely. A messenger arrives. The king is wounded. Suddenly, her authority expands overnight. She is no longer a placeholder. She is the government. Seals change hands. Orders are issued in her name. You feel the kingdom subtly reorient around her presence, like furniture shifted in a familiar room. One mainstream fact hums beneath it all. Some regencies lasted decades, not months, shaping legal systems and foreign policy long after the marriage that enabled them faded into ceremony. These queens didn't just hold power, they defined eras. But nothing here is stable. Every decision she makes sets precedents others will challenge later. If she succeeds, critics will say she overstepped. If she fails, they will blame her gender, her origins, or the marriage itself. You sense how thin the margin is between respect and rebellion. As time slides forward again, you realize this. Royal marriages didn't just transfer land and gold, they transferred governance. A bride could become the hinge on which a kingdom turned, quietly, efficiently, and often without thanks. You carry that image onward, the firm hand on the map, the signature drying on parchment, knowing that soon belief itself will enter the marriage. And when faith is involved, kingdoms rarely stay calm for long. You move forward without pause, and the map table dissolves into an altar again. But this time the tension isn't about land or money. It's thicker, heavier, almost electric. Faith has entered the marriage, and belief does not negotiate easily. You stand in a cathedral where incense hangs like fog, and you realize that a single vow spoken here can tilt an entire kingdom's conscience. One mainstream historical fact grounds you immediately. Royal marriages frequently required one spouse to convert religions, and those conversions often triggered sweeping changes in law, worship, and political allegiance. You watch a bride kneel. The crowd holds its breath. Is this sincere faith or strategic obedience? The question doesn't have a clean answer, and it doesn't need one to cause trouble. When a ruler converts, especially publicly, it signals more than personal belief. It announces which clergy will gain favor, which doctrines will be protected, and which practices may quietly become dangerous. Historians still argue whether these conversions were genuine expressions of faith or carefully staged performances demanded by political necessity. You can feel why the debate never settles. Belief, after all, lives inside people, but policy lives outside them. You drift through streets afterward and you see the consequences unfold. Churches gain new patrons. Monasteries lose land. Prayer rhythms shift. A new calendar of holy days appears, confusing people who still count time the old way. Royal marriage has reached into kitchens and fields, altering what days are worked, fasted, or feared. There's a strange, almost unsettling detail that surfaces. Some newly converted royals kept private chapels where they practiced their former faith in secret, at least for a while. Servants were sworn to silence. Candles were lit behind locked doors. Remember that official belief and personal belief didn't always match, and kingdoms felt the strain of that mismatch. You notice how resistance simmers quietly at first. Murmurs in taverns. Sermons that grow sharper. Symbols scratched into doors at night. Faith gives people language for loyalty and rebellion alike. When a royal marriage imposes a religious shift, it doesn't just change laws, it rewires identities. One light joke drifts through the seriousness. Nothing wakes people up faster than being told their grandmother's prayers are suddenly out of date. You stand in a council chamber where advisors argue whether enforcing religious conformity will stabilize the realm or tear it apart. Some argue unity is worth the cost. Others warn that belief cannot be legislated without consequences. Historians still argue whether forced religious alignment through marriage strengthened states in the long run or planted seeds of later revolts. You follow a procession where new religious symbols are carried through the capital. Some cheer. Others watch in silence, calculating. A marriage meant to secure peace now walks a knife's edge. Faith has memory. It remembers insults longer than treaties do. One mainstream fact echoes strongly here. The marriage of rulers across confessional lines in early modern Europe often intensified religious conflicts, contributing to uprisings and wars that lasted generations. You feel how a single conversion at an altar can echo into battlefields decades later. You drift into a rural parish where the changes arrive slowly. The priest hesitates over altered prayers. Parishioners glance at one another, unsure whether to comply or resist. This is where royal marriages truly affect entire kingdoms, not in palaces, but in places where people don't have the luxury of abstract belief. Their faith is routine, comfort, identity. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In some regions, people blended old and new practices for decades, creating unofficial hybrid rituals that baffled visiting officials. Candlelight prayers to saints long out of favor continued quietly, long after the marriage that condemned them was celebrated. Policy declared victory, practice took its time. As night settles again, you sense how fragile unity becomes when belief is involved. Gold can be counted. Bloodlines can be traced. Faith lives in hearts, and hearts are famously uncooperative. Royal marriages that demanded conversion didn't just alter dynasties, they rewired the spiritual geography of entire populations. You carry this forward, feeling the hum of belief still vibrating in the air. Soon, you'll see what happens when faith, blood, and money collide around a single question: who comes next? You follow the hum of belief out of the cathedral and into council chambers again, but this time the air is tense with expectation. Succession looms. The quietest words, heir, child, birth, carry the weight of armies, treaties, and centuries-old grudges. Royal marriages are rarely about two people. They are about futures, and futures are fragile. You see scribes recording birth announcements as though they were military dispatches. Every pregnancy is scrutinized. Every miscarriage sparks whispered fears. One mainstream historical fact settles the room. Succession crises caused by childless royal marriages frequently sparked wars, rebellions, and disputes that embroiled multiple kingdoms for decades. You feel that weight pressing down not on rulers, but on the people who serve them: taxpayers, soldiers, courtiers, even midwives. Historians still argue whether succession crises were more politically destabilizing than foreign invasions. From here, you can understand both perspectives. A missing heir can unbalance diplomacy as completely as a defeated army. And yet, unlike a battlefield, the crisis is intimate, unfolding in bedrooms and nurseries, where chance and biology play roles that politics cannot control. You notice how superstition creeps into the equation. Courtiers consult astrologers, physicians, and dream interpreters. One queen reportedly carried a small statue of a saint under her pillow during every pregnancy, believing it would protect the child, and perhaps, you suspect, herself from the stress of endless scrutiny. That's your quirky tidbit. Superstition runs alongside dynastic planning like a shadow twin. Remember it, rationality and ritual often coexisted in these courts. You drift into a room where factions quietly form. Some nobles push for the eldest surviving son. Others see advantage in a daughter marrying abroad. Every faction frames their preference as the kingdom's best interest, but you know better. They are hedging bets, consolidating power, and testing loyalties. The queen, regent or not, must navigate this minefield delicately. One light joke drifts into your mind. Medieval politics is basically a never-ending game of family monopoly, except bankruptcy sometimes involves real castles. The birth finally comes. Bells ring. Celebrations ripple through the capital, yet the relief is temporary. A premature death or infant illness can undo weeks of planning. You sense the anxiety in the courtier's laughter, the subtle checking of the baby's pulse in portraits painted years later. Fertility is not private, it is national security. You watch alliances shift overnight. Marriages among heirs are negotiated before the child can even walk. Dowries are recalculated. Future rulers are effectively betrothed while still in swaddling clothes. Historians still argue whether these early engagements produced more stability or more resentment among the nobility and population at large. A quirky scene emerges. Some courts employed nurse spies, caretakers who were loyal to the queen, reporting on children's health and household dynamics. These nurses could subtly influence succession by shaping which children received preferential care. You chuckle faintly at the idea, spies in diapers, but the implications are deadly serious. You notice a pattern forming. Succession crises, combined with alliances, marriages, and wealth, create a network where personal life and political strategy are inseparable. The kingdom's fate hinges on bodies, documents, prayers, and gold simultaneously. Every heartbeat has political consequence. By nightfall, you feel the full weight of this web. Heirs are born, futures are claimed, and already plots are whispering through the halls. Royal marriages may begin with a ceremony, but their most potent influence extends across generations, quietly shaping who sits on thrones and who pays the price. And as you drift forward, you sense that personal feelings, love, fear, resentment, will soon collide with duty in ways that neither blood nor gold can entirely contain. You walk quietly through the halls where children's cries have faded, replaced by murmurs of something more insidious: the collision of personal affection and public duty. Royal marriages were often imagined as alliances, but humans, flawed, curious, stubborn humans, insisted on complicating the plan. Here, affection and resentment swirl in equal measure, and you feel the tension like static electricity in the air. One mainstream historical fact anchors you. Many royal couples genuinely disliked one another, Yet the political machinery of marriage forced cooperation. Their households became arenas where private quarrels could trigger public crises. Even small gestures, a curt glance, a withheld smile, might ripple outward, influencing council decisions or diplomatic correspondence. You notice the bride, now queen in her own right, retreating briefly to her chambers. She has allies, yes, but also enemies embedded in every nook of the palace. Personal grievances are never truly private. You can almost hear them whisper through tapestries. If she shows favoritism, someone loses influence. If she falters, someone else benefits. Historians still argue whether interpersonal dynamics between royal couples had measurable political consequences, or if historians simply enjoy reading juicy letters centuries later. There's a quirky and vivid detail. Some couples communicated with secret code, subtle gestures at feasts, coded letters delivered by loyal attendants, even hidden notes sewn into garments. It's like a medieval texting app, only slower, more perilous, and capable of starting a war. Remember that. Human ingenuity finds its way even under the weight of dynastic expectation. You drift to the queen's private garden, imagining the quiet moments. Here, she might laugh, sigh, or confide in a trusted lady-in-waiting. Yet even here, her thoughts are never entirely her own. Every decision about children, finances, and alliances reverberates outside these walls. Love and duty are entangled in ways that modern couples can hardly imagine. One light joke drifts. The only thing more complicated than medieval marriage contracts was trying to sneak a chocolate truffle past courtly etiquette. You sense how tension builds between duty and desire. Some couples grew genuinely affectionate, learning to admire intelligence or humor. Others despised each other but maintained appearances, because a single public quarrel could destabilize alliances and embolden enemies. Fertility, succession, and diplomacy constantly intrude on intimacy. One mainstream fact: Henry VII's early marriage to Catherine of Aragon, for example, started affectionately but collapsed under the weight of childlessness and political ambition, ultimately reshaping English religion and government. You float into a banquet hall where laughter masks stress. You notice small fissures forming in the social fabric. Courtiers choose sides, whispering about which spouse to support, which intrigues to advance. Affection becomes leverage. Jealousy becomes policy. Even private letters are treated as potential evidence in disputes over power or succession. Historians still argue whether domestic unhappiness influenced statecraft significantly or simply made for entertaining anecdotes later. A quirky detail hums at the edges. Some queens kept small personal objects, locks of hair, miniature portraits, even toys for children to maintain private joy in the midst of public theater. These tokens remind you that even as marriage manipulates nations, small human moments persist stubbornly like wildflowers in palace gardens. By nightfall, you sense the precariousness of affection in these corridors. Love is optional, duty is mandatory, and consequences reach far beyond the bedroom. One misplaced smile, one hidden resentment, and alliances can wobble. Bloodlines may be questioned. Policies may shift. Royal marriages are quiet dynamos of chaos, producing reverberations that echo in unexpected corners of kingdoms. And as you drift forward, you feel that the stage is set for tension between foreign brides and local populations, the next ripple in this ever-expanding web of influence. You follow the thread outward from private chambers into public streets, where foreign brides arrive and local courtiers brace themselves. The palace doors swing open, and suddenly the kingdom feels larger and stranger. Customs, accents, and even clothing bring the outside in, and the population responds in ways that are both subtle and explosive. One mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Foreign queens often faced hostility upon arrival, and their presence could provoke riots, boycotts, or whispered campaigns against their influence. You sense it immediately: the tension in marketplaces, the nervous glances of servants, the polite distance of nobles who don't yet know whether to treat her as family or interloper. You notice the bride stepping carefully through a city unfamiliar to her. She carries herself with grace, but every misstep is magnified. One wrong word, one strange custom ignored, and the rumor mill begins to churn. Historians still argue whether xenophobic backlash against foreign consorts was primarily cultural, political, or a mix of both, and whether that resistance strengthened or weakened royal authority. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some foreign queens brought peculiar habits that seemed trivial but became symbolic. One reportedly insisted on wearing a hat indoors because of frost back home. Locals whispered that it was arrogance. Courtiers noted that she was preserving her dignity. Small eccentricities often turned into political statements, whether intended or not. Remember that perception often outweighed reality. You drift into the council chambers, where advisors debate every decision as if the bride's origin is a variable in a math equation. Marriage is not just a domestic affair. It is now a diplomatic variable with measurable outcomes. Alliances hinge on her decisions, her familiarity with local customs, and her ability to navigate intrigue. One light joke floats through. Apparently, mastering etiquette in 3 countries simultaneously was considered a royal survival skill. You sense the population's mixed reactions. Some embrace her as a new hope, welcoming the potential for fresh alliances and trade opportunities. Others resist, whispering that she brings foreign influence, taxes, or bad luck. A marketplace can become a political theater in miniature. One peasant's insult or jest may ricochet through courtiers to advisors to the throne. Power flows through gossip as easily as through ink decrees. You notice the queen adapting. She studies local language, customs, and food. She forms networks with influential ladies and discreetly earns loyalty among guards. Her presence, initially alien, begins to stabilize. Yet even as she gains acceptance, her foreign origin remains a tool for her enemies, an excuse to question judgment, loyalty, or competence. Historians still argue whether foreign consorts ultimately strengthened political alliances or merely complicated them. There's a lighter human moment. The queen occasionally teaches her native songs or dances to attendants, creating secret moments of joy amidst constant scrutiny. These small gestures build quiet alliances of trust and loyalty. You smile faintly. Every kingdom, after all, runs on a combination of fear, duty, and tiny acts of kindness. By the evening, you feel the subtle tension that persists when foreign brides enter established courts. They bring connections, wealth, and influence, but also suspicion, envy, and cultural friction. Royal marriages aren't just unions of 2 people. They are collisions of worlds, each ripple affecting politics, loyalty, and daily life. And as you drift forward, you notice how marriage treaties begin to read like contracts written in rings, gold, and bloodlines. A reminder that every vow carries a legal and political echo far beyond the altar. You glide into a dimly lit chamber stacked with parchments, wax seals, and the faint smell of ink. Here is where treaties are born, sealed, and sometimes quietly ignored. Marriage has evolved into a legal instrument, and every word written in those contracts carries consequences far heavier than the couple themselves. You realize you are watching the machinery of kingdoms move with the subtlety of a spider weaving a web. One mainstream historical fact grounds you. Many European treaties were negotiated simultaneously with marriage agreements, effectively turning a union into a diplomatic document that bound states together as much as families. You can almost hear the scribes' quills scratching across parchment as alliances solidify, debts are acknowledged, and contingencies mapped. You notice how symbolism drips from every gesture. Rings, crowns, and gifts are not mere decoration. They are signatures of intent. One peculiar detail surfaces. In some marriages, wedding rings were engraved with tiny maps of contested territories, serving as both a gift and a silent reminder of what was at stake. Remember that diplomacy often hides in plain sight. You drift closer to an advisor presenting the clauses of a treaty. The language is precise, conditional, and sometimes deliberately ambiguous. Historians still argue whether the complexity of marriage treaties was designed to prevent wars or to provide loopholes when war became convenient. You feel the tension. Ink can enforce obedience, but ambition often finds a way around it. A light joke drifts through the seriousness. Medieval diplomats apparently believed that if you couldn't confuse your rivals with Latin, you hadn't done your job. Gold enters the scene again, inseparable from legality. Dowries, gifts, and joint claims are spelled out meticulously. Money guarantees obligations. If a dowry is delayed, a marriage contract can justify mobilizing troops. You watch as a single line about land rights can ripple across armies, finance, and diplomacy. Royal marriages, you realize, convert affection into enforceable political and legal structures. You sense the delicate balance between flexibility and rigidity. Too rigid, and you spark rebellion. Too flexible, and rivals exploit loopholes. Courts thrive on the tension, and you notice how negotiators rely on precedent as much as persuasion. One quirky note: some treaties included absurdly specific clauses, like the height of a future groom at age 16 or the color of ceremonial robes, a bizarre mix of practicality and superstition. As the night progresses, you feel the power of symbolism unfold further. A single letter, sealed and delivered, can confirm claims, challenge legitimacy, or even provoke conflict. Treaties written in rings, coins, and parchment turn a personal relationship into an instrument of statecraft. Historians still argue whether these arrangements prevented conflict or merely postponed it under a veneer of civility. You follow the flow into the countryside. Farmers and town officials may never see the royal couple, yet their daily lives bend according to decisions made in ceremonial halls. Roads are repaired to honor treaties, taxes adjusted, and troops stationed according to marriage clauses. You realize that the ripple effect is continuous, affecting generations who will never know why borders shifted or laws changed. One light joke surfaces quietly. Nothing says "I love you" in medieval diplomacy like a clause guaranteeing military support. The irony hangs in the air. By dawn, you feel the full weight of these arrangements. Marriages are no longer merely unions. They are enforceable promises, instruments of peace and war, contracts written in gold, ink, and loyalty. And as you drift forward, fertility and heirs await, ensuring that the next cycle of obligation begins before the last one ends. You follow the soft echoes of inked treaties into nurseries and chambers filled with infant cries, because now the future is literal. Heirs arrive, and with them come anxiety, expectations, and politics. Fertility is not a private matter in royal marriages. It is national security incarnate. Every heartbeat in these rooms is monitored, calculated, and whispered about in halls far beyond the cradle. One mainstream historical fact grounds you. Producing an heir was often considered the primary duty of a queen, and failure to conceive could precipitate political crises, annulments, or even wars of succession. You feel the gravity pressing in. These are not just family matters, they are matters of state. You notice the queen pacing softly, wrapped in shadows, as she contemplates her own body's role in shaping the kingdom's future. She is advised constantly, by physicians, astrologers, and courtiers, on timing, diet, and ritual. Some instructions are rational, others absurd. A quirky tidbit: one medieval physician reportedly suggested that a queen should sleep with a rooster perched on the windowsill to encourage male offspring. You chuckle faintly. Superstition and statecraft coexist in strange, persistent ways. Historians still argue whether pressure to produce heirs affected decision-making and health, or whether these anxieties are modern projections onto historical narratives. You feel the tension. The queen's personal life is inseparable from policy, and every success or failure reverberates through councils, treasuries, and battle plans. A newborn heir is finally presented to the court. Bells ring. Courtiers clap. Gifts are distributed. Relief spreads across the palace, but it is temporary. Every premature birth, every illness, every moment of uncertainty carries potential for crisis. Political factions reposition. Alliances form and dissolve around a single child's survival. You sense how delicate the balance is. The kingdom's stability hangs on the fragile rhythm of an infant's heartbeat. One light joke emerges. Apparently, the phrase "sleeping like royalty" was never meant for actual parents of heirs. Exhaustion is universal, even when dynasties depend on it. You drift into the corridors where siblings of the heir are raised, and you see that succession planning is relentless. Future marriages are negotiated before the children can walk. Dowries and alliances are plotted with military precision, intertwining bloodlines across kingdoms. You notice the pattern. Fertility, heirs, and lineage form a triad that dictates everything from tax policy to foreign diplomacy. The tension is amplified in distant lands, where allies and rivals monitor every birth announcement. A single heir can tip the scales of power, triggering secret agreements, military planning, and diplomatic overtures. Historians still argue whether dynastic fertility crises had greater impact than outright military conquest, but the pattern is undeniable. The future of nations was often tied to bodies and biology. A peculiar detail surfaces. Some courts employed midwives as unofficial intelligence agents, reporting on pregnancies, health, and even domestic conflicts. You realize that surveillance and statecraft begin long before adulthood. Even playrooms are subtly politicized. By nightfall, you feel the immense tension that heirs introduce. Fertility transforms marriage into a generational project, extending influence and obligations decades into the future. Love, duty, and politics collide endlessly, ensuring that royal marriages are never merely ceremonial. They are engines of continuity, conflict, and strategic foresight. And as you drift onward, you sense the subtle energy building toward scandal and reform, where unions that shock the court can bend laws, traditions, and entire societies. You follow the whisper of scandal before it is spoken, creeping through corridors and drawing every eye. Royal marriages are not just alliances, they are theater, and sometimes the plot twists shock the audience. A match that seems secure can suddenly spark controversy, forcing laws to bend or even break under pressure. One mainstream historical fact anchors you. Some marriages, like that of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, triggered legal reforms, religious upheavals, and long-lasting political change. You feel the tension. A private union transforms into a public crisis, affecting laws, churches, and foreign alliances. You probably won't survive the gossip mill that follows, but that's the point. Royal marriages are public property, whether the couple likes it or not. You notice courtiers exchanging coded glances. Every rumor, every subtle gesture becomes potential evidence in palace intrigue. Historians still argue whether scandal truly altered the course of statecraft, or if it merely colored the narrative of history for later audiences. Either way, consequences are real and immediate. There's a quirky detail. In some courts, scandalous marriages required elaborate rituals to normalize the union, including public penances, theatrical reconciliations, or staged gestures of loyalty. The spectacle itself becomes a tool to manage perception. Remember that appearances often matter more than reality in royal politics. You drift into a council where legal minds debate the validity of a controversial marriage. Clauses are dissected, loopholes explored, precedents consulted. Even minor ceremonial errors, like forgetting a specific blessing, can be weaponized to annul unions. The law dances delicately around personal lives, transforming private choices into instruments of governance. Gold, power, and religion intersect here. One light joke drifts. Apparently the phrase "love makes the world go round" didn't apply to kings. Laws and dowries did. You follow the ripple outward. A scandalous match does more than shock the palace, it shifts alliances. Neighboring states reconsider treaties. Nobles reassess loyalties. Merchants anticipate instability. The marriage, once private, now dictates international relations. A peculiar, almost human moment. Some scandalized royals maintained small, private rituals, reading, music, or clandestine walks to maintain sanity amidst political chaos. These acts remind you that even when marriages reshape nations, the people at the center are still human, craving small comforts. You sense the duality. Scandal threatens authority but can also be transformative. Laws are reinterpreted. Traditions bend. Societies adapt. One mainstream fact settles in. Legal reforms in England, France, and Spain were often triggered or accelerated by contentious royal marriages. Historians still argue whether these reforms would have happened without scandal, but the evidence is compelling. By nightfall, the energy is electric. Marriage has demonstrated its full force. It can shock, reform, destabilize, and solidify simultaneously. You feel the kingdom teetering between tradition and change, with every scandalous union leaving fingerprints across law, policy, and culture. And as you drift forward, you sense that the same strategies of marriage diplomacy are now stretching across oceans, binding colonies and distant territories into the same web of influence. You drift across oceans without leaving the palace, carried by the invisible threads of marriage. Royal unions now extend far beyond Europe, exporting influence, law, and obligation to distant colonies. Maps are redrawn quietly, often in inked margins rather than on battlefields. One mainstream historical fact grounds you. Marriages between ruling houses frequently determined colonial claims, with territories legally assigned to heirs before any explorer planted a flag. These unions exported dynastic politics across seas, turning marriages into tools of empire. You feel the reach. A single wedding can affect trade, taxation, and governance thousands of miles away. You notice the bride, or sometimes a groom, receiving letters from distant territories. Governors report on loyalty, crops, and local disputes. Heirs are instructed on administration they may inherit long before they leave home. Historians still argue whether dynastic marriages truly stabilized colonial governance or simply imposed European structures that created long-term tension with local populations. A quirky detail floats past. Some colonial governors were required to wear miniature portraits of the monarch or consort in their hats, as a visible reminder of the marriage that legitimized their authority. Remember that symbolism and compliance often travel together. You follow the economic threads, tightly wound around trade routes and ports. Dowries, gifts, and inheritance settlements provide capital to establish colonies or finance expeditions. A wedding ring can ripple across oceans as much as across a dining hall. Gold moves faster than armies, and bloodlines legitimize claims abroad. One light joke drifts. Apparently, empire building was just a really expensive version of matchmaking. You drift into distant capitals, observing local reactions. Colonists, indigenous populations, and distant officials all adjust to the invisible authority conveyed by marriage. Loyalty is measured in obedience, tax revenue, and ritual acknowledgement of distant monarchs. You sense how these unions create networks of obligation, stretching farther and wider than the original couple could have imagined. A personal, human detail surfaces. Some royal brides correspond with local families, sending gifts or letters to build goodwill. These small gestures often prevent rebellion or foster cooperation, showing that diplomacy is not only about treaties, but also about quiet personal effort. You sense the tension between local customs and imported expectations. New rulers may impose European norms on distant territories, provoking resistance. Historians still argue whether these marriage-linked colonial policies promoted stability or exacerbated cultural tensions that lasted centuries. As night deepens, you follow heirs sent abroad to govern lands tied to their parentage. Education, marriage contracts, and political alliances are pre-planned, sometimes before the child has even reached adolescence. You notice the intricate weaving of bloodlines, gold, and governance forming a lattice that binds continents together. One whimsical detail. Some colonial children were sent with tutors specializing in both European etiquette and local languages, a bizarre dual curriculum intended to create obedient, cultured rulers from an early age. You smile faintly, imagining tiny princes mastering diplomacy before mastering their own shoes. By dawn, you sense the full scope of influence. Royal marriages no longer shape just cities or kingdoms, but entire continents, threading dynastic control into global politics. And as you drift forward, you feel the fragility emerging, the delicate interplay of love, duty, and distance that will eventually test these unions in ways nobody can fully predict. You drift back across oceans and into courts once again, but now the focus is consolidation. Years have passed, heirs have grown, and dynasties stretch like networks of fine threads through kingdoms and continents. Royal marriages now serve to maintain, rather than just create, alliances. But the work is constant, subtle, and sometimes invisible. One mainstream historical fact grounds you. Strategic marriages were used to consolidate power internally, uniting rival noble houses and preventing rebellions by intertwining familial loyalties. You feel the tension. Every handshake, every feast, every arranged meeting is a negotiation mediated by blood and protocol. You notice how older queens, kings, and regents wield influence through mentorship and patronage. They guide younger rulers, sometimes quietly controlling appointments, taxation, and foreign policy through the promise of marriage or alliance. Historians still argue whether such influence was more effective than formal legislation or simply a way for seasoned rulers to maintain relevance. A quirky detail emerges. Some royal courts maintained marriage calendars, charts tracking ideal ages for betrothals, auspicious dates for ceremonies, and projected fertility windows. The charts look like astronomical tables, blending superstition, astrology, and demographic planning. Remember that even logistics become ritualized when bloodlines are at stake. You drift into a council where discussions of trade, defense, and taxation are constantly influenced by marriage ties. A single alliance, forged decades earlier, still dictates naval deployments or troop placements. Gold and kinship continue to overlap like two rivers flowing through the same valley. One light joke drifts. Apparently, you could solve half of Europe's disputes with a marriage, and the other half by arguing over whose wedding gifts were fancier. You sense the subtle friction between old and new alliances. Some houses resist integration, clinging to regional identity. Others embrace intermarriage as a ladder to greater influence. Royal marriages now serve as both glue and leverage, binding some territories while subtly threatening others. A personal touch appears in the forms of letters, gifts, and personal counsel exchanged between spouses across borders. These interactions maintain both familial affection and political alliances, showing that diplomacy often wears the guise of intimacy. You notice the repetition of patterns. Dowries still arrive, heirs are still betrothed, and legal contracts are still dissected. History repeats, but now with more experienced actors, aware of precedents, calculations, and consequences. Historians still argue whether this repetition stabilized kingdoms or entrenched inequalities and rigid hierarchies. By evening, you see the quiet human element. Joy, frustration, love, and resentment weave into the fabric of duty. A queen advises her daughter on marriage choices. A king mentors a son on alliance building. Courtiers anticipate every ripple. Royal marriages remain engines of diplomacy, population management, and global influence, but they are also inexorably human dramas played at colossal scale. As night settles, you sense that consolidation is both reward and trap. Kingdoms strengthen, yet the same threads of obligation, inheritance, and loyalty can unravel with a single misstep. The future remains alive, unsteady, and intricately bound to every vow spoken centuries ago. You drift now into the subtler consequences, the long shadows cast by centuries of arranged unions. Royal marriages have done more than secure borders, build alliances, or fill treasuries. They have shaped identities, cultures, and even national psyches. You feel it in the streets, in marketplaces, and in quiet libraries. Traditions carried through marriage outlive the rulers who first initiated them. One mainstream historical fact anchors you. Dynastic marriages often transmitted not just political power but cultural practices, languages, fashions, and even cuisine. You can see, for instance, how Italian customs influenced French court life, or how Spanish court etiquette migrated to Austria via Habsburg marriages. You notice the sensory richness, fabrics, scents, spoken accents, and ceremonial gestures weaving into daily life, sometimes without anyone consciously recognizing their origin. You sense tension where these cultural exchanges clash with local traditions. Resistance sometimes bubbles up in subtle ways. Festivals altered, local laws bending awkwardly, noble households divided between embracing and rejecting foreign influence. Historians still argue whether cultural integration through royal marriage generally promoted stability or exacerbated social friction. A quirky detail emerges. Some brides brought obscure pets, plants, or foods from their homeland. One English queen reportedly insisted on introducing cherries from her native orchards, which became a symbol of novelty and prestige at court. Remember that influence is often disguised in tiny, seemingly mundane gestures. You drift into the realm of education and etiquette. Young princes and princesses are taught multiple languages, diplomatic protocol, and domestic arts, all informed by the marriage connections of their parents. These lessons are subtle tools of power, designed to perpetuate alliances and prepare heirs for a world where bloodlines dictate destiny. You notice that fashion becomes diplomacy in another guise. Dresses, hairstyles, and ceremonial colors signal alliances and loyalties. One light joke drifts through the scene. Apparently, knowing whose grandmother wore which color to which coronation could prevent a war or provoke one. The influence extends to religion, literature, and art. Marriage can redirect patronage, funding monasteries, commissioning paintings, or establishing schools. One mainstream fact surfaces. Several Renaissance artists owed their commissions to interdynastic unions, with queens commissioning works that reflected both personal taste and foreign influence. Art becomes an ambassador as potent as any envoy. A personal detail emerges. Some royal couples maintained private cultural rituals, like celebrating a foreign holiday or preparing ancestral dishes for children. These small practices maintain connection, loyalty, and identity amidst the broader machinery of dynastic politics. By nightfall, you sense the slow but inexorable shaping of kingdoms, not just by treaties, armies, or wealth, but by everyday life transformed through centuries of marriages. Royal unions ripple outward, influencing customs, tastes, beliefs, and loyalties in ways both subtle and profound. And as you drift forward, you feel the final threads tightening. History itself is shaped not only by kings and queens, but by the marriages that bound them, their heirs, and their cultures into an intricate living network. You drift into the present moment of all those centuries of planning, love, ambition, and obligation. Royal marriages have left their fingerprints everywhere, on borders, laws, languages, and even the way people imagine loyalty and family. You feel the weight of all that history pressing gently, like a tapestry too large to see all at once. One mainstream historical fact anchors you. European royal marriages over centuries helped shape modern nation-states, creating dynastic claims that determined wars, peace treaties, and succession laws for generations. You sense the continuity. Choices made in candlelit chambers still ripple into modern borders and political expectations. You notice how memory preserves both fact and myth. Legends of love, betrayal, courage, and cunning are passed down alongside records of treaties and dowries. Historians still argue whether the popular stories of royal passion reflect reality or serve as narrative tools to explain complex politics in digestible human terms. A quirky detail emerges. Some courts maintained memory rooms, filled with portraits, gifts, and souvenirs of past unions, to remind current rulers of precedent. You smile faintly at the idea. Imagine entire walls whispering advice from centuries of marriages. Remember that the past is never silent. You drift into the lives of descendants. They inherit not just thrones but cultural practices, claims to foreign lands, and obligations written long before they were born. Bloodlines intertwine, alliances remain active, and minor disputes in one generation can echo centuries later. One light joke drifts. Apparently, in royal families, gossip is more enduring than tax law. You notice how symbolism persists. Crowns, rings, and ceremonial robes are more than ceremonial. They are living reminders of obligations, loyalties, and history itself. Policies are still influenced by marriage alliances long concluded. Even today, historians trace diplomatic precedents back to these unions. You sense the personal stories behind all the politics. Affection, resentment, ambition, and curiosity wove into every marriage, producing outcomes both intended and accidental. Some marriages strengthened kingdoms, others sparked wars. Some reshaped culture, others left enduring mystery. You feel the human core behind the machinery of dynasties. Love, duty, and survival intertwined inseparably. A final quirky detail drifts in. A handful of queens maintained small personal libraries filled with books from their homeland, which would later influence court culture and education for generations. Even the smallest personal act echoes outward when dynastic politics are involved. As night settles softly around you, you see the full scope. Royal marriages were never just about two people. They were contracts, alliances, cultural exchanges, political strategies, and instruments of historical continuity. They shaped economies, religions, art, diplomacy, and identity, leaving an invisible web that persists even today. And as you settle into this thought, you feel the final quiet of centuries merging into one continuous hum, the enduring impact of love, duty, and human ambition. You feel the pace of history slow, stretching each moment until it almost floats. The palaces, markets, battlefields, and nurseries soften into gentle shadows, and the cacophony of politics fades into a distant hum. Imagine the flickering candlelight, the whisper of parchment, the faint rustle of silk dresses, the tiny human details that shape the fate of nations. Royal marriages, you realize, were not merely ceremonies or political tools. They were engines of continuity, subtle agents of culture, and quiet shapers of ordinary lives. Gold, blood, faith, and affection wove together into patterns that you can trace if you look carefully, but you can never fully control. Each vow, each alliance, each decision echoed beyond the couple, beyond the court, beyond even the continent itself. And yet, amidst all the weight and complexity, there were small acts of humanity. A shared laugh between spouses, a secret letter, a tiny gift of comfort, a private ritual preserved behind palace doors. These moments remind you that behind every policy, every treaty, every succession, there were people experiencing hope, fear, joy, and sorrow, the same emotions you carry tonight. Let the kingdoms, the marriages, and the dynasties dissolve slowly in your mind. Picture the soft glow of distant castles, the rustle of trees in palace gardens, and the quiet rhythm of lives intertwined across centuries. You are drifting now through time itself, carried by memory and imagination, cushioned by history and narrative. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your thoughts can settle, your imagination can wander gently, and the stories of royal marriages can lull you toward rest, carrying the lessons, curiosities, and whispers of the past into dreams. Sweet dreams.